Ancient Rome is a world of violence and debauchery with gladiators fighting to the death, chariots crashing and burning and orgies happening everywhere. But life in the Roman Empire wasn't all about bloodlust and dirty jokes, right? The reality was more complicated than that. Even though ancient Rome had its problems, like any other big city, it also had everyday people trying to live their best lives. And let's face it, Romans were pretty good at living large. But what about when they wanted to spice things up in the bedroom? Let's talk about sex slaves and senators, shall we? So first off, who were these sex slaves in ancient Rome? Well, they were enslaved people who were bought specifically for one job, satisfying the sexual desires of their owners. They weren't prisoners of war or criminals like some other types of slaves. They were literally sex objects. These slaves often came from Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Roman Empire liked to hang out, and they weren't considered property in the same way other slaves were. Instead, they were kind of like a high-end luxury item. You know, something to show off if you could afford it. And because of this, they were usually better treated than other slaves and might even get some perks like living in the main house instead of working outside. But why were the senators so into these Greek sex slaves? Well, maybe it was just because they liked variety. Or maybe they were actually into BDSM. Who knows? But they were totally down for some rough stuff, especially if you were a woman. You see, Romans really liked their women athletic, tan, and muscular, kind of like the Greek ideal. So if you were a female sex slave, you were expected to work out and get jacked. I mean, they even had special gyms just for you. So if you didn't want to be, getting busy, you could always say you had a workout to go to. Now, you might be wondering, how did these senators find these exotic dancers? Well, they went to brothels, of course, but not the kind you're thinking of. In ancient Rome, brothels were more like massage parlors or saunas, where you could go to relax and maybe get a foot rub. It was a place to socialize and meet people, not necessarily to get, busy. To actually find a sex slave, you had to go to a special type of brothel called a thermopolium, which was reserved for elite prostitutes and sex slaves. These places were a bit more private and discreet than your average brothel, and catered to the wealthy Romans who could afford to pay top dollar for, top-tier entertainment. It was also common for Roman men to have harems of both male and female sex slaves in addition to their wives. I mean, hey, why not? If you can swing it, having a variety of partners to choose from can spice things up in the bedroom. Just make sure you keep track of who's who and maybe invest in some, barrier methods to prevent any unwanted pregnancies. But wait, there's more. These sex slaves weren't just for the pleasure of the wealthy elite. They were also used as a form of entertainment. Imagine attending a gladiator match, and after the blood and guts are done, the victors throw a party with live music, dancing, and sex slaves. Yeah, it was a real thing. These parties were called cinae, and were basically the Roman version of Studio 54. Only the most elite members of Roman society were invited, and the revelry went late into the night with lots of wine, drugs, and dancing. Sex slaves were often dressed in elaborate costumes and encouraged to engage in lewd behavior to titillate the guests. It was basically the Roman equivalent of a strip club, except with more debauchery and probably worse hygiene. But don't worry, the sex slaves weren't completely helpless. Even though they were enslaved, they still had some agency and could negotiate terms with their owners. If you were willing to put up with the occasional back rub or foot massage, you might be able to secure better treatment, nicer clothes, or even a say in where you traveled to. Some sex slaves even managed to become fairly wealthy by charging their own prices for their services and keeping their earnings. Now that's some entrepreneurial spirit. The most famous example of a successful sex slave turned businesswoman is probably Phryne, an ex-slave who became one of the wealthiest women in Athens. She was so rich, in fact, that she was able to buy her freedom and that of her family members. Now, that's a happy ending. But let's get back to the shady side of ancient Roman love lives. One of the most salacious rumors surrounding the Roman emperors was their alleged fondness for chariot racing. Those exciting races where horses pull chariots around a racetrack and try not to murder each other. It was all the rage in ancient Rome. The emperors would attend chariot races regularly and bet huge sums of money on their favorite teams. And let's face it, what's more thrilling than watching a bunch of heavily whipped horses race around a track while screaming fans placed huge bets on the outcome? Oh, wait, never mind. It's just a bunch of sweaty guys trying not to kill each other. But it gets weirder. Rumors swirled that the Emperor Nero chained women to his chariot like horses and whipped them as they pulled him around. Talk about a bizarre form of transportation. Maybe he was just trying to add some excitement to his daily commute. Or perhaps he was a big fan of that whole romanticism meets BDSM aesthetic. Who knows? But it definitely made for some juicy gossip. Another rumor claimed that the Emperor Caligula kept a harem of male and female sex slaves, who he chained up in his pleasure boat, the luxurious and aptly named Nero. What kind of activities went down on that boat will forever remain a mystery. And let's not forget about the infamous orgies of ancient Rome. These wild parties were legendary, involving up to 20 people at a time. There was no shortage of willing participants in the Roman Empire, both male and female. In fact, there were so many sex workers and prostitutes in Rome that they had their own neighborhoods, known as Lenicaria. These areas were specifically designated for sexual activity and were often located near taverns and bathhouses. But the Romans weren't just having regular old, boring orgies. No, they liked to spice things up with some weird and unusual kinks. One popular pastime was whipping, which may sound painful, but was actually a consensual and kinky way to spice things up in the bedroom. The Romans also had a thing for role-playing, dressing up as hairy wild men, and letting loose in taverns and brothels. And who can forget about the golden showers? Yep, the ancient Romans were into that too. Emperor Nero was rumored to have hosted parties where guests urinated on one another for their amusement. It was considered a status symbol to have golden-colored urine, which was achieved by, you guessed it, drinking a lot of expensive wine. So, if you were at one of Nero's parties and someone started sprinkling you with gold, just take it as a compliment. Now, it is important to remember that not everything we know about the intimate lives of ancient Romans comes from reputable sources. Much of what we know is based on gossip, rumors, and the writings of people who had an axe to grind with the emperor. However, there is evidence to suggest that the Romans were indeed pretty wild when it came to their sex lives. Archaeologists have discovered a number of erotic works of art depicting everything from orgies to golden showers. And let's not forget about the infamous bronze of the charioteer, a sculpture so explicit that it was banned from display in the British Museum. Oops, but hey, maybe the Romans just had a different definition of classy. All we can do is look at the evidence and draw our own conclusions. After all, they were masters of making their own pleasure a spectacle. And speaking of pleasure, now it's time for you to give me a thumbs up if you learned something new today. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but their orgies certainly were.